Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna leave you alone.
I gotta mute this. Thank you all for joining us today. Just a couple of reminders before we get started. Just please keep your microphones and videos off during the presentation. Also, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll relay them to our speaker after the presentation. Also, again, if you need a certificate for participation, please contact Marilyn. So today we have Milena, again from the Department of Labor and Human Rights, and she is going to be talking about accommodations and modifications. So Milena, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. My name is Milena Stojkovic. I am compliance investigator with the Department of Labor and Human Rights. I've been with the department for almost 20 years, primarily investigating complaints of discrimination and wage and hour issues. Some of you probably attended last week presentation, so there might be a little bit repetition in the beginning, but later we'll go to more specific information related to today's topic. So Department of Labor is a small state agency. However, we have three distinctive areas of work or divisions. One is wage and hour division, human rights division, and we also do education and awareness, and that is the reason why I'm here today. Department of Labor's Human Rights Division enforces several laws. You can see them on your screen. Human Rights Act, which is discrimination law, Housing Discrimination Act, Whistleblower Statute, and Public Employee Relations Act. One of those laws that I mentioned is Housing Discrimination Act. That is the act that was enacted in 1999. Other laws that we also enforce is Fair Housing Act of 1968, which is a federal law. We have a work sharing agreement with U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which gives us authority to file complaints alleging both violation of state as well as federal laws. So when we talk about these discrimination laws, let's first talk about what is housing discrimination. In general, treating someone differently in the sale or rental of housing, and also in participating in housing programs because of a person's membership in a protected category is basically discrimination. So singling a person out because of that person's protected category or categories. Um, Under the Fair Housing Act, federal law, those protected categories are race, color, religion, sex, national origin, familial status, meaning having children under the age of 18 or securing custody of minor children, and disability. Under the State Housing Discrimination Act, we have several more protected categories: race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, disability, receipt of public assistance, for example, Section 8 voucher, marital status, age pertaining to individuals of age of 40 or older, and certain victims of domestic violence are also covered. Um, there are certain exemptions from these laws. I mentioned them last time. If an owner has 4 or fewer rental units and the owner lives in one of those units, that owner is exempt from fair housing laws. There are also some religious exemptions, private club exemptions, and housing for elderly, specifically designated for elderly and also certified as such. However, landlords or its representative agents are never exempt from making discriminatory statements or publishing or advertising that's about the sale or rental. Advertising that would indicate any preference or limitations or discrimination because of persons' protected classes or class. Those statements could be verbal statements, newspapers, advertising, publications, social media, um, except again for older persons, private clubs. For example, a landlord can give preference to club members, but that preference cannot be based on protected classes or and also religious organizations. For example, a landlord can say preference in rental is given to club members, but not to only white club members or only black club members or only female club members. So that's what that means. When we assess whether any statement is discriminatory or gives preference or indicates preference, we use a reasonable person standard, whether a reasonable person hearing the statement could hear or understand that the statement indicates such preference. So now let's talk about specifically about reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. Oh, sorry. Reasonable accommodations. Accommodation is a change or exception or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service that might be necessary for a person with disabilities to have an equal opportunity or equal access to use and enjoy a dwelling, a unit, rental unit, including public and common use spaces, or to fulfill their program obligations. Any change in the way things are customarily done that enables a person with disabilities to enjoy that housing opportunity or to meet program requirements is a reasonable accommodation. In other words, reasonable accommodations eliminate barriers which otherwise would prevent a person with disability from fully participating in housing opportunities or enjoying that dwelling, including both private housing and federally assisted programs and activities. Since rules, policies, and practice and services may have different effect on persons with disabilities than on other individuals, treating persons with disability exactly in the same manner as others sometimes would deny person with disabilities an equal opportunity to enjoy a dwelling or participate in certain housing programs, for example, which would be discriminatory. Keep in mind that not all persons with disability will have a need to request or be entitled to reasonable accommodations. However, all people with disabilities have a right to request or be provided with a reasonable accommodation at any time. Also is worth noting that housing providers may not require persons with disabilities to pay extra fees or deposits or place any other special conditions, requirements, or restrictions of receiving housing, receiving reasonable accommodations. Examples of reasonable accommodations can be all kinds. Assigning an accessible parking space for a person with mobility impairment. Let's say housing provider has designated parking space. A person with disability who has, let's say, mobility impairment may request to be assigned um, a certain parking space which is closest to the accessible entrance or closest to the accessible route, making an exception to a no pet policy and allowing person with a disability to have a service animal or assistance animal. We talked about that last week, permitting an applicant to submit a housing application via different means, something different than standard practice, waiving a guest fee for a live-in home health aid for a tenant with disability is one of the examples. So when we talk about reasonable accommodations, they are always associated with the people with disability. So just a reminder what is actually disability and how it's defined under the Fair Housing Act or laws. Disability means a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits at least one major life function or life activity, or a record of such impairment, or being a person regarded as having such impairment. So that definition has kind of three prongs. Um, the term physical or mental impairment includes variety of diseases or medical conditions. Some of them are listed here. You can see visual, orthopedic, autism, epilepsy, etc. Keep in mind that current use of illegal drugs is not covered under the fair housing laws. The term substantial limits suggests that the limitation is significant or to a large degree, usually compared to general population. Term major life activity means those activities that are of central importance to daily life, such as seeing, hearing, walking, breathing, manual tasks, caring for oneself, working, learning, speaking, even socializing. So often a question is asked, when and how should an individual with disability request a reasonable accommodation? Under the fair housing laws, a resident or an applicant for housing makes a reasonable accommodation request whenever he or she makes clear to the housing provider that he or she is requesting an exception, change, or adjustment to a rule, policy, practice, or service because of his or her disability. That resident or applicant should explain what type of accommodation he or she is requesting, and if the need for accommodation is not readily apparent or not known to the provider or not obvious, explain the relationship between the requested accommodation and his or her disability. It is not necessary to use magic word or submit a written request to a landlord or housing provider, use any special words. However, a person making request is always encouraged to do so to avoid any possible miscommunication or misunderstanding. Um, those who request reasonable accommodations may also want to keep copy of their request and supporting documentation just in case there is later dispute um, when and how and what was requested. Likewise, housing providers are also encouraged to keep good record of requested accommodations and any activities or action taken. Another question, I mentioned this last time, if some of you attended, is can a landlord ask for documentation? And the answer is yes, maybe, depending on the circumstances. If a person's disability is obvious or known to the housing provider, and the need for the requested accommodation is also obvious or readily apparent or known, then the provider may not request any additional information about the requester's disability or the disability-related need for the accommodation. If the requester's disability is known or obvious to the provider, but the need for accommodation is not readily apparent or known, then the provider may request only that information that is necessary for the provider to evaluate the disability-related need for the accommodation. So it all depends what is known or apparent. For example, a rental applicant who uses a wheelchair advises a housing provider that he wishes to keep an assistance dog in his unit, even though the provider has no pets policy. The applicant's disability is readily apparent. He is in a wheelchair, but the need for the assistance animal is not obvious to the provider and not known. In that case, a housing provider may ask the applicant to provide information about his disability-related need for the dog. In response to a request for reasonable accommodation, a housing provider may request reliable disability-related information. Again, that is necessary to verify that the person meets the definition of the disability, meaning having physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more life activities. Number two, that describes the needed accommodation. So what is that person is requesting, and shows the relationship between these two, because between the person's disability and the need for the requested accommodation. In other words, why is it necessary for a person to have such accommodation? Lately, last couple of years, we've seen whoever is involved in this business has seen that some individuals provide documents supporting their needs for reasonable accommodations, documents that are obtained from the internet. In HUD's experience, such documentation from the internet is not by itself sufficient to reliably establish that an individual has a non-observable disability or disability-related need. For example, for an assistance animal, that's most common request. By contrast, keep in mind that particularly these days, many legitimate licensed healthcare professionals deliver service remotely, including over the internet. Um, One form of reliable documentation is a note from a person's healthcare professional that confirms a person's disability and need for example, for an animal or for any type of accommodation, is when the provider has personal knowledge of the individual, when the provider is, for example, a treating physician or treating social worker or treating therapist. Um, there are only two questions that housing providers should consider when a request for with a request for reasonable accommodation. Again, does the person seeking accommodation have disability? And does the person making the request has disability related need for the accommodation? Person might have disability, but not necessarily the need. So those are the two main questions that each time a housing provider should ask himself or ask a person with disability making such request. A no answer to either of these questions mean that the housing provider is not obligated to make a reasonable accommodation, which means either a person doesn't have disability or a person doesn't have a need. And accommodation is not necessary. If the answer is yes to both, then fair housing laws require an exception to a rule, policy, or practice, meaning a fair housing laws require a landlord or housing provider or program provider to provide requested reasonable accommodation. What if another tenant also has disabilities, such as, for example, allergies that won't allow, for example, for service animal to be in the unit? In these kind of cases, we are talking about competing disabilities. And I mentioned this last week, the housing provider might need to accommodate both individuals, the individual who is requesting to have service animal or assistance animal on the premises, and also a person who, let's say, next door neighbor who has allergies to those animals. If a reasonable accommodation request is denied because it would impose a fundamental alteration to the nature of the provider's operation, or it would cause some undue financial or administrative burden, the housing provider should still engage in interactive process to discuss if there was alternative accommodation that might be affected in meeting the individual's disability-related need, which means housing providers should still discuss the request for accommodation to see if there is anything else that can be provided to a person with disability, not necessarily the one that he or she requested, but something else that has the same effect and meets his needs. So let's talk now about reasonable modifications. So what are reasonable modification? What is the definition? Reasonable modification is a structural change made to existing premises occupied or to be occupied by a person with disability in order to afford such person full enjoyment of the premises. So making a structural change. Those accommodations can include structural changes to interiors as well as exteriors of a dwelling, and also to common and public use areas. Under Fair Housing Act, federal law prohibited discrimination include refusal to permit at the expense of the person with disability, reasonable modifications of existing premises, either occupied or to be occupied by such person, which might be necessary to afford that person a full enjoyment of the premises. So who is responsible for paying for those modifications? The fair housing laws provide that while housing provider must permit the modifications, the work, the tenant is responsible for paying the cost of the modifications. In general, there are some other circumstances under which a landlord is responsible, so we'll talk about that. So in general, a landlord must permit that modifications be provided. However, the tenant is responsible for paying for the cost of work and material. Housing providers that receive federal financial assistance are also subject to a different law, which is the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, specifically Section 405. And that Section 405 of the Act prohibits discrimination based on disability. And under that section, a housing provider is required to provide and pay for the structural modifications as a reasonable accommodation unless it amounts to an undue financial and administrative burden or changes the business altogether. So there is another law, federal law, that requires a landlord who receives federal money to make those modifications, which are under this act called reasonable accommodations, and pay for those modifications. If an undue burden or fundamental alteration exists, the recipient of that federal funding is still required to provide any other reasonable accommodation up to the point that would not result in an undue financial or administrative burden on the particular recipient of federal funds or constitute a fundamental alteration of the program. So if a landlord claims that it is too expensive or it would change the nature of the business or it would cause some other administrative or financial burden, they still have to do whatever is possible to accommodate or provide modifications to the point which would not result in that financial burden. For example, a tenant uses a wheelchair and lives in privately owned housing, and the tenant needs a roll-in shower in order to bathe independently. Under the Fair Housing Act, the tenant would be responsible for the cost of installing the roll-in shower as a reasonable modification to his unit. And the landlord will have to accommodate or provide that, allow that modification. Another example, a tenant who uses a wheelchair and who lives in housing that receives federal financial assistance needs a roll-in shower in order to bathe independently. Under that Rehabilitation Act that I mentioned, Section 504, the housing provider would be obligated to pay for and install the roll-in shower as a reasonable accommodation to the tenant, unless doing so was an undue financial and administrative burden, or unless the housing provider could meet the tenant's disability-related need by, for example, transferring the tenant to another appropriate unit that already has a roll-in shower. Other examples of reasonable modifications could be installation of a ramp into a building, lowering the entry threshold to a unit, installation of grab bars in a bathroom, replacement of doorknobs with levels, installing peephole in a door so a person can see who is at the door before he or she opens it, widening doorways to make rooms more accessible for a person in a wheelchair, lowering kitchen cabinets or counters to a height suitable for a person in a wheelchair, altering a walkway to provide access to public and common use area. There could be variety of modifications. To show that a requested modification may be necessary, again, the person requesting a modification there must be identifiable relationship or nexus between the requested modifications and the individual's disability. And in addition to that, the modification must be reasonable. A tenant or a person with disability cannot request modifications that would not be reasonable, that would, for example, knock all walls down and or change the height of the building or something like that. Are reasonable modifications restricted to the interior of the dwelling? No, they, as I mentioned earlier, reasonable modifications are not limited only to the interior. They can be also made to public and common use areas, such as widening entrance to fitness centers or laundry rooms, or for changes to exteriors of a dwelling unit, such as installing a ramp at the entrance to the dwelling. So it does not have to be restricted only to an apartment. What if a structural change being requested by the tenant or applicant in the building is subject to the design and construction requirement under the Fair Housing Act, and the requested structural changes are a feature of accessible design that should have already existed in the unit or common areas, for example, wide doorways, etc. So Fair Housing Act provides that cover multifamily dwellings built for first occupancy after March 13, 1991 shall be designed and constructed to meet certain minimum accessibility and adaptability standards. If any of the structural changes needed by the tenant are ones that should have been already included in the unit or public and common use areas when constructed, then the housing provider may be responsible for providing and paying for those requested structural changes, because they should have already been included if the building is built and receive occupancy certificate after March 1391. However, if the requested structural changes are not a feature of accessible design that should have already existed in the building pursuant to these requirements, then the tenant is responsible for paying for the cost of the structural changes as reasonable modifications. So this is very important. It all depends when the building is built and whether those changes are already included in these accessibility requirements. Design and construction provisions do not only apply to certain multifamily dwellings built for first occupancy since 1991. A tenant may request reasonable modifications to housing built prior to that day. In those kind of cases, the housing provider must allow the modifications, and the tenant is responsible for paying for those, for the cost. For example, a tenant with disability who uses a wheelchair resides in a ground floor apartment in a non-elevator building that was built in 1995. Buildings built for first occupancy after 91 are covered by the design and construction requirement of the Fair Housing Act. Because the building is a non-elevator building, all ground floors under these requirements all ground floor units must meet the minimum accessibility requirements of the Act. The doors in the apartment are not wide enough for passage using a wheelchair in violation of the design and construction requirement, but can be made so through retrofitting. Under these circumstances, the tenant may have a potential claim against the housing provider. So what is important here to know when the building was built and first occupied, whether the modification should have already been included and who would be responsible for paying. And so in this particular example, this particular tenant might bring a complaint against the tenant, against the landlord. Another example, a tenant with disability resides in an apartment in the building that was built in 1987. The doors in the unit are not wide enough for passage using a wheelchair, but can be made so through retrofitting if the tenant meets the other requirements for obtaining modifications, which are, the person is a person with disability and has a disability related need, then in that case, the tenant is responsible for paying for the cost under the fair housing laws because the building is built prior. So let's talk a little bit about who is responsible to pay for the upkeep or maintenance of those modifications. The tenant is responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of a modifications that is used exclusively by him or her. If a modification is made to a common area that is normally maintained by the housing provider, then the housing provider is responsible for the upkeep and maintenance of that modification. If a modification is made to a common area that is not normally maintained by the housing provider, then the housing provider has no responsibility under the fair housing law to maintain the modification. For example, because of a mobility disability, a tenant installs a ramp in the lobby of a multi-family building at her own expense. The ramp is used by other tenants and the public as well as the tenant with a disability. In that case, the housing provider is responsible for maintaining the ramp. In addition to current residents, are prospective residents or buyers of housing protected by the reasonable modifications provisions of the Fair Housing Act? Yes, not only those who are currently residing, but also potential residents and potential buyers. A person can make a request for reasonable modifications at any time during residency or prior. An individual may request a reasonable modifications of the dwelling at the time that the potential tenancy or purchase is discussed. And under the fair housing laws, a housing provider cannot deny or restrict access to housing because a request for reasonable modification is made. Such conduct would constitute discrimination. The modifications does not have to be made, however, unless it's reasonable. Keep that in mind. So how to make and when to make these reasonable accommodations? Under the fair housing laws, a resident or applicant for housing makes modifications wherever he or she makes clear to the housing provider that he is requesting permission to make a structural change to the premises because of his disability. That person should explain that he or she has disability. If that is not readily apparent or known to the housing provider, that person should also explain what type of modification he or she is requesting And it will also explain the relationship between the requested modifications and the disability. An applicant or resident is not entitled to receive reasonable modifications unless he or she requests one. It is not up to housing provider to make guesses. However, the Fair Housing Act does not require that the request be made in a particular manner or at a particular time. A person with disability need not personally make the request. The request can be made by a family member or someone else acting on his or her behalf, which can be an advocate or somebody else. The question is also, does a person with disability have to have a housing provider's approval before starting to make these modifications of the dwelling, before a person takes hammer and starts knocking walls down or making those structural changes? Yes, the law requires that the person always obtains landlord's approval. A person with disability must have the housing provider's approval um, in order before making those modifications. However, if the person with disability meets the requirements under the Act for these modifications and provides the relevant documents and assurances, the housing provider cannot deny that request. Another question often comes up is, can a landlord request alternative modifications, alternative design for the proposed modifications that does not cost more, but the housing providers consider more aesthetically pleasing? In general, the housing provider cannot insist on an alternative modifications or alternative design if the tenant complies with the requirements for reasonable modifications. If the modification is to the interior of the unit and must be restored to its original condition where the tenant moves out, then the housing provider cannot require that its design, the landlord's design, be used instead of the tenant's design. However, if the modification is to a common area or an aspect of the interior of the unit that would not have been restored because it would not be reasonable to do so, and the housing provider's proposed design imposes no additional cost and still meets the tenant's need, then the modification should be done in accordance with the housing provider's design. So this is also very important to know. What if housing provider landlord wants more costly design for the requested modifications? If the landlord wishes modifications to be made with more costly material in order to satisfy the landlord's aesthetic standard, the tenant must agree only if the housing provider pays for those additional costs. Further, housing providers may require that the tenant obtain all necessary building permits and may require that the work be permitted in a workmanlike manner. If the housing provider requires most costly materials to be used to satisfy her workmanship preferences beyond the requirements of the applicable local codes, the tenant must agree only if the housing provider pays for those additional costs as well. And in such case, the housing provider's design must still meet the tenant's need or needs. What type of documents or assurances may a housing provider require regarding these modifications before granting a reasonable modifications request? A housing provider may require that a request for reasonable modifications include a specific description of the proposed modifications, both before changes are made to the dwelling and before granting the modification. A description of the modification um, uh, to be made may be provided to a housing provider either orally or in writing, depending on the extent or the nature of the proposed modifications. And a housing provider may also require that the tenant obtain any building permits needed to make the modifications, and that the work be performed in a workmanlike manner. So just to make assurance that the work is done properly. Another question is, may a housing provider or homeowner association condition approval of the requested modifications on the requesters obtaining special liability insurance? And the fair housing law says no. Simple. Once housing provider agrees to reasonable modifications, may he or she insist a particular contractor be used to perform the work? And the fair housing law says no, the housing provider cannot insist that a specific or particular contractor do the work. The housing provider may only require that whoever does that work, the work is reasonably able to complete the work in a workmanlike manner and obtain all necessary building permits. Once these modifications are made, what happens with them after the tenant moves out? The tenant, under the law, the tenant is obligated to restore those portions of the interior of the dwelling to the previous condition, only where there is reasonable to do so, and where the housing provider has requested the restoration. The tenant is not responsible for expenses associated with reasonable wear and tear. That's also important to keep in mind. In general, if the modifications do not affect the housing provider or subsequent tenant, somebody who will occupy unit afterwards, tenant's use or enjoyment of the premises, the tenant cannot be required to restore the modifications to the prior state. A housing provider may choose to keep the modifications in place at the end of the tenancy. For example, because the tenant uses a wheelchair, she or she obtained permission from her housing provider to remove the base cabinets and lower kitchen sink to provide for greater accessibility. In that particular case, it is reasonable for the housing provider to ask the tenant to replace the cabinets and raise the sink back to its original heights. Another example, because of mobility disability, a tenant obtained approval from the housing provider to install grab bars in the bathroom. As part of that installation, the contractor had to construct reinforcement on the underside of the wall, so behind the wall. These reinforcements are not visible and do not detract from the use of the apartment or that specific bathroom. It is reasonable for the housing provider to require the tenant to remove the grab bars, but it's not reasonable for the housing provider to require the tenant to remove the enforcement behind the wall. Another example, because of mobility disability, a tenant obtained approval from the housing provider to widen doors to allow him to maneuver in his wheelchair. In usual circumstances, it would not be reasonable for the housing provider to require him to restore the doorways to the prior width to make them more narrow. If a person with disability has made a reasonable modifications to the exterior of the dwelling or common area, in those cases, must the person restore it to the original condition where he or she moves out. Reasonable modifications such as ramps to the front door of the dwelling or modifications made to the laundry rooms or building entrances, hallways, common areas are not required to be restored. They can stay after the tenant moves out. One of the reasonable modifications made to the exterior of the dwelling that must be restored must the person with the disability pay to make those restorations when he or she moves out. The law says yes, reasonable restoration of the dwelling required as a result of modifications made to the interior of the dwelling must be paid for the tenant unless the next occupant, the next tenant of the dwelling, wants to retain the reasonable modifications, those same features, and where it's reasonable to do so, the next occupant is willing to establish a new interest-bearing escrow account in case of later restorations. The subsequent tenant would have to restore these modifications to the prior condition at the end of his tenancy, if it's reasonable to do so, and if requested by the housing provider. Can a housing provider increase or require a person with disability to pay security deposit if he or she requests a reasonable modification? And the law says no, the housing provider may not require an increased security deposit as a result of a request for reasonable modifications, nor may the housing provider require a tenant to pay a security deposit when one is not customarily required. A housing provider may be able to take other steps to ensure that money will be available to pay for restoration of the interior of the premises at the end of the tenancy. For example, because of mobility impairment, a tenant requests a reasonable modifications that includes installation of grab bars in the bathroom. The tenant has excellent credit history, has lived in the apartment for 5 years before becoming disabled, and under these circumstances, it might not be reasonable to require payment into escrow account. Another example, because of a mobility impairment, a new tenant with poor credit history wants to lower kitchen cabinet to a more accessible height. It may be reasonable in that case for the housing provider to require payment into an interest-bearing escrow account to ensure that funds are available for restoration at the end of the tenancy, that there'll be money to pay for that restoration. What if a person, for example, person with disability moves into a rental unit and wants the carpet to be removed because her wheelchair does not move easily across the carpeting? People ask, is that reasonable accommodation or reasonable modification? And depending on the circumstances, removal of carpeting may be either a reasonable accommodation or a personal modifications. For example, if the housing provider has a practice of not permitting a tenant to change flooring in the unit, and there is smooth finished floor underneath the carpet, generally allowing the tenant to remove the carpet would be considered as reasonable accommodation. So how do I know what to do? Question often asked by landlord and housing providers. Get educated. Today's session is one of the ways to get educated. Visit our website or give us a call, or visit HUD's website. HUD has on their website, you can search using certain words and get lots of information about legal requirements. And if you're not able to do so, but you can always visit with your attorney who is knowledgeable in these fair housing laws. What we recommend always when dealing with your tenants or applicants or participants in program is to document everything. Don't make sudden rash decision. Take time to think what was requested before saying no to these requests. Also keep your managers and your staff trained, especially those that are directly dealing with public. And again, contact an attorney with experience and be consistent in your practice. You can see on your screen our phone numbers and our website and our email, and you can always contact us. Keep in mind that we cannot speak and answer questions specific to specific situation that you might be dealing with, because we would be issuing opinion on a potential complaint without conducting full investigation. But in any case, we'll do our best to point you to right direction or provide legal requirements information so you can draw your own conclusion.
All right, thank you. We do have a few questions.
Okay.
If it is an addiction to prescribed medication, is it a disability?
Can you repeat the question, please?
If it is an addiction to prescribed medication, is it a disability?
Well, it all depends. A current use of illegal substances is those individuals who have current use of illegal substances are not covered under fair housing laws. So whatever impairment they have as a result of that might not be covered under the law, might not be disability.
Okay. Drug use is not considered a disability. What about alcoholism? They can get SSI or SSD for that. And I have one client who got SSI for drug dependency, but has not been arrested for years.
Well, I can't speak about Social Security Administration regulations or laws and how they determine disability or not. But if you go back to, let's find that. Alcoholism under the fair housing laws is considered disability. As you can see, physical impairment includes a number of diseases and conditions. And you see the last line, mental impairment, emotional drug addiction other than current use of illegal substances, and also includes alcoholism.
Okay. I am confused about the guy in the wheelchair example wanting a dog. I am assuming he has to provide a doctor note, not necessarily specifying why he needs the emotional support animal.
Correct. That example says, let's say a person with disability who has mobility impairment and is in a wheelchair requests that that a landlord who has no pet policy allows this person with disability to have an animal. Okay. In that particular case, that particular example, it is obvious that there is a disability or impairment, okay? But the need for that accommodation is not apparent, is not obvious. In other words, it is not clear to a landlord why this person in a wheelchair needs that animal. In that case, a landlord may not request a tenant to provide verification that he or she is a person with disability because it's obvious, but may request that a tenant provides doctor's note why this tenant needs assistive animal.
Okay. And the last question, I have a question about reasonable accommodation for Section 8. If a person needs a rail put in after having surgery and the house was built before 1991, who is responsible for paying for that rail? She only wanted a rail, not a ramp, and the landlord would not put one in. There are 2 steps to go into the house. But if there was 3, wouldn't it need a railing anyways?
Well, in general, under the fair housing laws, the tenant would be responsible for installing that railing, okay? However, if the landlord receives federal funding, if the landlords receive money, let's say from HUD or any other federal sources, in that case, the landlord might be responsible to pay for the requested modification.
All right. As of right now, there seems to be no other questions. Oh, hold on.
Okay.
Yes, this was a follow-up to that last question. They said, yes, the landlord receives Section 8 housing money, which is federal.
Again, you know, I can only tell you in general, you know, not specific to this specific situation, but in general, the law says if a housing provider receives federal funding, then in that case, that Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act kicks in, the responsibility or the liability kicks in. In that case, a landlord might be responsible to pay for the cost.
Okay.
So,
There was one more question that came in.
okay.
Is surgery opted by a tenant considered a disability? Example, knee surgery that heals?
It all depends whether there is a physical impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, and whether it's temporary. Let's say I can twist my ankle and for 7 days not be able to walk, okay? Is any condition considered disability? Not really. You know, most often impairment that's lasting longer period of time, more than few months or more than few weeks, can be disability. But if it's temporary, you know, then most likely it would not be considered as disability. It depends on the severity of impairment, duration of that impairment, how much limits the person, for how long. Those all factors should be considered when determining.
All right, well, that seems to be the end of the questions.
Okay, thank you so much for having me today.
Yes, thank you so much for all your information the last 2 weeks. Again, for those that are still on, if you need a participation certificate, please email Marilyn. Also, just thank you guys all for attending today's session, and thank you, Milena, for presenting the last 2 weeks.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And I think that is our conclusion. So everybody have a good rest of the day.